Okay, well, maybe it's time for us to begin. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening for those of us who are in Russia. Welcome to this seminar of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies in partnership with PONARS Eurasia. We're here to discuss the situation in Russia, and for once, we won't be talking about COVID-19, or we may be, but that will not be our main focus, which is also good to remember that there are other things happening that happened before, happening at the same time, and will continue to happen and shape the situation. And this time we will be discussing the political situation in Russia, the constitutional reform that Vladimir Putin launched just before the crisis, the sanitary crisis, and the kind of more globally, the grassroots mobilization and how the society is reacting to the change of power, legitimacy, and power mechanisms. And for that, we have two great speakers who are here with us today, Hale and Simeonov. So let me just say a few words about them before giving them the floor. Hale is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at GW and is co-director with myself of the PONARS Eurasia program, and is working on identity politics and political system change. And then Simeonov is a senior researcher at the Center for Comparative History and Politics at the Perm State University, and also an associate research scholar at Macmillan Center in Yale. And he has been working on opposition, mobilization, civic and urban activism, and electoral and subnational politics in Russia. And both of them have been recently publishing a memo, each of them. So 2 memos on the PONARS website, exactly on the topics we will be discussing today. So if you are interested, we invite you to also look at the PONARS website and download our memos. So I will give each of you the floor for 15 minutes, and then we will open for a Q&A. I will ask everybody to ask your question in the Q&A box that you see on the right of your screen. If you use this box, then your question will be public. If you want to ask a private question, an anonymous question, you can use the chat box and direct the question to me. In any case, I will moderate all the questions arriving, trying to group them by topics, and give the floor back to our speakers for discussing that. So you split the Q&A box. So welcome once again. And Henry, do I give you the floor first?
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much, Marlene, for the invitation, and thank you to everybody. It's an interesting topic to talk about. So just to get things going, as is known, in January of this year, Putin made a surprise announcement that constitutional reforms were necessary in Russia. He had alluded to that a little bit beforehand, but the scope of the proposal was a novelty. Then a couple months later, in March, he revealed that these amendments would now include a resetting of his count towards his term limits. That is, his current term is set to expire in the year 2024. And by the previous draft of the Constitution, that should have been his final, at least consecutive term. He would have had to leave the presidency by then. And so now, according to the amendments, his count would be reset, which would give him the right to another 2 terms in office if he wins re-election in 2024. And then, in addition to the constitutional reforms, and they're including a reset, there's to be a plebiscite. They just call it, Putin called it just a голосование, a voting, so not formally a referendum. It was scheduled originally for April 22nd. And then it was postponed due to the COVID-19 crisis. So yes, we are going to wind up having to talk, I think, about the virus. But in any case, so today what I want to do is address 5 basic questions, which are why did Putin move to remove term limits? Secondly, why was it announced when it was? Why now instead of later? Third, why escape term limits in this particular way, given that many different options had been discussed as possibilities? Fourth, what would the result have been had the plebiscite that was originally scheduled for April 22nd actually been held on that day? And fifth, how is the current health crisis likely to impact things going forward, and what should we expect? And in sum, my main argument will be that the virus has substantially upended what was originally a good bet to keep Putin in control of the reins of power in Russia for quite a long time, and that the Kremlin now, in fact, faces very significant threats on the horizon to its political control. So, first of all, why remove term limits? To many people, this is obvious, just to keep power. I think, in fact, it's a little more complicated than that. And if you look more specifically at the problem, the way I think about it is that the basic, what this move basically did was helped Putin escape what might be called the lame duck problem, or the lame duck syndrome, long before the actual moment of truth comes in 2024, when by the old constitution, somebody else was supposed to take power. And this is significant, getting rid of the lame duck problem, because even if Putin had actually wanted to hand off power to an associate, it becomes very dangerous when you're a lame duck, because you can lose control of the process. The vast majority of regime collapses in post-Soviet space, in presidentialist systems, have been precisely when leaders were lame ducks, when they were in their constitutionally final term in office. There are only a couple exceptions to that pattern, the Euromaidan in Ukraine being one of them. And the basic problem is that when a leader is in their final term in office, and when people start to expect or suspect that, well, this leader might actually leave power, all the people around him have incentive to be jockeying for position in case that kind of succession happens. And so that means that the leaders and other elites in the system are effectively looking towards a future beyond Putin, or whoever the incumbent leader happens to be, and therefore paying less attention to the incumbent leader. And then that can lead to a very fast and surprising collapse of incumbents' authorities, even in regimes that look on the surface very stable. And so I think this was a very significant problem. And so what removing the term limits did, or the term limit count for Putin, or at least pushing it back for another 16 years, means that Putin basically is keeping his options open. So I think there's still a possibility he'll decide not to run, and that could happen for any number of reasons. He could still do all the things that other people have said he might want to do, lead Security Council or do something like that, do some other reform. But this basically keeps his options open. So the second question is, why was this announced when it was? 2024 is a long way away. But in fact, the 2024 problem is actually already a today problem, and it was a then problem already looking back to last year. First of all, what happens in these kinds of systems is when succession is on the horizon, elites and people who have interest in succession, powerful groups, don't wait until the last minute to prepare, right? They start preparing. They start trying to demonstrate their strength. They start trying to establish the dominance of their own position over other people in the system who also all support Putin, but are rivals within that system. And so parliamentary elections that take place before succession presidential elections have a tendency to become what some people have called elite primaries for the elites. So they're kind of like, you might have a number of pro-Putin parties competing, for example, or groups competing for getting their deputies in. They might all be pro-Putin, but what they want to do is to become the dominant pro-Putin group, or they might start already distancing themselves from the leader if they think that this might help them in the larger succession struggle. So effectively, succession battles start to play out long before they actually come to a head. In fact, if you look at some of the color revolutions, a number of them took place in parliamentary elections before the ultimate succession election was destined to take place. So the Rose Revolution in Georgia was like that, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, for example. And even before that, other elections start to take on extra meaning as harbingers of succession. People interpret them in this light. And so this means, in Russia's case, also regional elections, which now take place in different regions every September. And we saw this happen in the Moscow City Duma election of 2019, where you had a significant battle, you had major protests, and significant opposition victories, all of which were kind of interpreted by many as potentially shaping the direction in which succession might take. And so, I think all these things meant that the succession pressures were already starting. And so it was better for the Kremlin to kind of try and nip this all in the bud now rather than wait for more and more of the succession tensions to mobilize. And I think the onset of the COVID-19 health crisis, plus the oil price collapse, the world oil price collapse, would only have heightened the risks faced by the regime in terms of succession. I mentioned the colored revolutions being about succession. You had battles pretty much everywhere where you've had succession on the table, but the leaders that have been the least popular have had the biggest problems and have tended to be the ones overthrown. So, the fact that something is on the horizon that might be damaging to the incumbent support could be a big problem. Why was it resolved in this particular way? There were lots of other proposals. Some said that, well, Russia would unite with Belarus and Putin would become the leader of a whole new country. Others said, well, maybe he would do another tandem kind of arrangement. There were different sorts of options. So in this case, he chose what struck me as a strategy very similar to that adopted by the Aliyevs in Azerbaijan, when Ilham Aliyev specifically in Azerbaijan, when he when he successfully escaped term limits by, first of all, arranging for a referendum. But the key point is that in the referendum on term limits, it wasn't just simply a referendum on term limits. In fact, what he did was he buried the term limit escape in a whole series of dozens of other amendments that were expected to be popular or otherwise kind of distract from the potentially risky effort to be seen as trying to alter the Constitution for one's own political interests. So if we look at Russian media strategy, if you just watch the television news, for example, or some of the other advertising, they don't emphasize the term limits as a reason for why people should vote for the constitutional amendments. They don't say that's not a reason to vote for it. They do mention it, but there's a lot more public coverage of amendments that are touted as enshrining and guaranteeing Russia's territorial integrity, barring foreign interference, the supremacy of foreign laws over Russian laws, kind of preventing that, and in particular, social support. So amendments to the Constitution that would guarantee quality health care, indexing of pensions, all of these things. And so it's presented as a package deal, and kind of that part isn't really discussed much, except to say, well, we have to do it all together because it's all a comprehensive problem. But there's no a la carte option. And so for this reason, people are basically said, okay, well, you got to vote one or the other. And the hope is that, well, even if people are uncomfortable about amending the Constitution to let Putin stay on, all the other good amendments that are in there that are very hard to oppose will lead a substantial number of people to go ahead and support them in any case. So fourth, what would the result have been had the plebiscite been held on April 22nd? Well, I think all signs seem to have been pointing towards victory, right? Not terribly surprising. We just saw, it's been reported, a survey that was conducted by Levada Center just a couple days after April 22nd. And basically it found that among likely voters, the result would have been 69% to 31%. That is, however, not counting 17% of voters who were undecided on how to vote. Those are people who said they would likely vote but didn't know how. And the 35% who said they were unlikely to vote were actually overwhelmingly opponents. So, to the extent that opponents can actually mobilize their backers to vote, the vote would be narrower. But even so, you have 47% of the entire population of Russia, according to this poll, that would have voted yes on the referendum. And so I think, therefore, the fact that the Kremlin was forced to delay the voting by the virus was painful, because basically they saw this opportunity to kind of get this vote and this extra seal of legitimacy on the escape from term limits slipping away from them to an indefinite later date. And so that brings up the fifth question I wanted to address, which is how is the COVID-19 crisis likely to impact things? Well, it seems to me the pandemic is having three consequences. And these together portend big problems for the constitutional vote and potentially down the road for the Kremlin itself. So first of all, I think it's fair to say the rally is not, the pandemic is not generating a rally around the leader effect, a rally around the flag effect. Sometimes people have said, well, national crises get people to want a strong hand and they unite around the leader. That's not happening in Russia. Instead, the polling evidence indicates that Putin is in fact being hurt. But what I would add is that it's not just that his trust level or his, kind of approval level is slipping a little bit in the polls. But the key is the pattern, how this is happening. He's being hurt in a specific way that I think reflects a dilemma for leaders like him, as well as many others, which is the pandemic is dividing society into people who fear catching the virus, who fear the pandemic, and then people who are not fearful of it and think it's kind of overblown and why are we overreacting this way? And so it's interesting that among those who fear catching the virus personally, Putin is not losing support. He comes out pretty well there. But where he's losing support is among people who are not fearful of the virus, those people who don't think it's a big threat to them personally. And those people specifically appear to be worried about the economic consequences. So when they have in mind the economic consequences of the virus, it's those people that withdraw support from Putin in particular. And so this creates incentives for Putin to try and straddle a middle ground, which I think a lot of leaders are trying to face, right? You want to kind of appear good to the fearful and the people who prioritize the economy. But what this has done is it's kind of withdrawn Putin from taking a very, pronounced hardline kind of policy that might project strong leadership. And effectively, what this has done is ceded the political rewards that are involved to governors. Because it's the governors then that appear to be more on the front line and taking the strong, decisive positions. Because Putin, as he said, Russia's a federal country, at least in name. And so, he's given governors more autonomy. And maybe he thinks, well, they'll be the ones to pay the price ultimately if the things go downhill. But in the short term, governors' ratings are going up. And they go up to the extent that people have in mind the virus. And so I think for succession in the long run, what this is doing is effectively creating additional potentially credible successors. If one of the problems for the potential for alternation in power in Russia has been that, well, Putin and the Kremlin has worked towards this, is seen as irreplaceable, as the only person. Well, now you're getting other people who are seen as taking strong positions in times that matter. And there's a possibility that some of them might become or be able to build up some authority as being seen as credible successors. And then, so the other thing that the pandemic does then, in combination with all this, is poses a grave threat to the economy that's already being felt. Nobody knows exactly how long-term the effects will be, but to the extent that Putin's support is always depended to some degree on the economy, the possibility that these economic problems will continue is a big, big concern. And so I think then that what this means is these problems will grow the longer that the pandemic goes on before it gets under control, and also the longer the plebiscite is delayed. And so I think this leads me to maybe kind of two scenarios with which I'll conclude. And then one is that, well, the virus settles down relatively quickly. Russia's undergone a spike in registered cases. If that settles down, if there's a decline, the Kremlin will probably be able to organize a quick vote. They'll probably try to do it as quickly as they can, maybe with some online voting, and maybe like in June. And if they can do it soon enough, it looks like their reserve of support is strong enough to clearly have a win. But if the virus continues to rage and the voting can't be held until later in the summer or even the fall, the popularity, if it continues to hurt in certain ways, the support for the leadership, there's a risk that the Kremlin could lose this referendum, I think. I mean, both because of lack of support, but also there's a possibility that anyone who becomes worried about extending the current team in power's rule will face kind of a now or never moment. Either you mobilize now or you wait till 2036. But I wouldn't expect a referendum to happen in this case. I think if they see public opinion trends going negative, it would be most likely that they'll just cancel the referendum. I mean, I'm calling it a referendum, but it's really, they call it a plebiscite or a voting. And he could just say, well, in the case of a health crisis, we can't expect people to vote. It'd be too risky to public health. So, they'll rely on the fact that formally, everything that's needed for a constitutional amendment to go into place has already been done. The voting is actually not necessary for approval. Putin just called it to give it an extra stamp of legitimacy. So I think that could be dispensed with. But I think what that will do, though, will be to set up the 2021 Duma elections as a potential major flashpoint for opposition, especially if the economy doesn't rebound fast. I mean, if things rebound fast and it turns out that the response wasn't too bad and people weren't too unhappy, then we might see something different. But I think there's a real risk of some major problems happening, and so it comes down to then whether they can find some additional way to gin up popular support, which I think leaves a lot of uncertainties. So I'll wrap up with that and look forward to discussion. Thanks. And
well,
Andre's remarks.
Thank you so much, Henry, for this really fascinating perspective on what is happening. Andre, I give you the floor now.
Sure, thanks. Just let me set up the presentation. So I'll start, I think, with what Henry stated as his first idea, that the constitutional reform was launched to duck the lame duck status. I definitely agree with that, and I think that was the idea, to keep all options available at the table. And I think in this regard, Putin is very much skillful in terms of maintaining this, deflecting the threats from within, from the elites, trying to maintain this power balance within this pyramid structure, etc. And I think this is for this sake, the regime is quite solid. At least prior to COVID-19 pandemic, it appeared to be quite solid. So my angle is different. I'm trying to understand how the challenge from below can structure or can shape the regime trajectory, and whether the urban mobilization, the grassroots mobilization matter for that sake. One apparent question could be whether it matters for the regime as such, because by definition, grassroots are something quite remote. They are mostly the collective actions we consider as grassroots are sort of collective actions organized by private citizens on local matters in urban areas or somewhere else, and they are quite distant from the Kremlin, so they do not pose maybe the direct threat to the regime. But I would argue that there are at least 4 reasons to believe that somehow they're relevant, and we have to take them into account when we're talking about the regime stability, regime trajectory, and also this kind of the attempts of the Kremlin to maintain the regime stability, the inter-elite balance, but also the contract with the society. So I would argue that there are 4 reasons to believe, at least, that the grassroots matter, and I will just walk through them, and maybe I'll show you some things that we are recently developing back in the center and in other projects as well regarding the grassroots mobilization. So one thing I think is that we have to admit is that grassroots are often forestall larger waves of contention. Consider the For Fair Action movement of 2011-2012. Before that, there were many prominent cases of mobilization on the local issues. Khimkensky Forest, the defense of Okta Center in St. Petersburg. In Kaliningrad, there was a huge mobilization in 2009 against the governor. But also in other places in the regional capitals, we saw that the local citizens forged the alliances with the political parties, with activists on some local matters, on transparency of government. In Tumen, there were instances of this kind of mobilization and grassroots activity. In Perm, so all across the metropolitan Russia, the signs of this mobilization were visible before the election moment in 2012. And that's why I think this is an important part of the waves of contention. So contention usually comes in waves or in cycles, and to keep this fire burning, to keep this the mobilization going, the grassroots constitute an essential part of that. They provide the modular actions. They provide resources. And I think this is an important sign of some larger strain in the society. So right now we know that in the previous year, Shias, Moscow protests, and even before that, there were a couple of these anti-garbage protests in the Moscow region. So again, it seems like there is something going on the ground in terms of grassroots, and they, again, if it were not for the pandemic, it could be the pretext for a larger wave of mobilization. And usually, again, the national mobilization, of course, is sort of focused on the focal points like elections and other things, and grassroots are less focal in this point, but in this regards. But still, I think there's a very important glue that sort of puts everything together, activist resources, and maintains this mobilization. So the second point is that grassroots usually, especially in the electoral authoritarian regimes like Russian, they are fertile ground for breeding the activists and aspiring politicians. When the other channels are closed, say the opposition parties are co-opted into the system, especially parliamentary opposition, or if you are an independent politician, you cannot run for elections, you're not registered, etc. The grassroots they present an opportunity to gain a political capital, to gain necessary connections and reputation. At the extreme, Navalny started his political career at Yabloko in 2005-2006 as the secretary of the Committee for the Defense of Moskowitz. So very much organization pretty much focused on the local issues, on the grassroots issues that were that plagued Moscow back in Lushkov's time. So I think this is a very important thing that the grassroots do provide some stream of activists and aspiring politicians to the system, independent of the power structures. The third point is that also the grassroots facilitate the resource transfer from the citizens to the opposition because they're not constrained by political institutional constraints or ideological constraints. They're more free to improvise on tactical choices, on frame building, and on many other aspects. Say, Shias, for instance, they started as the classic environmental justice campaign. Then they blended with the idea that with a perennial contention that there is a tension between the center and periphery, between the Moscow and the regions. Then additional frames came into play: the transparency of government, corruption, the irresponsibility of this government, of the governors and the political elites. And I think this sort of improvisation in frames and in tactical choices. Shias is also important in terms of establishing certain repertoire of contention with the camps, with the watch guards organized around the site of construction in Arkhangelsk region. So, in short, they do provide certain resources that could be transferred from citizens to the opposition and then used for the political purposes. And lastly, I think, in a larger sense, the grassroots are less manageable for the regime. So the regime is pretty much skillful in dealing with the traditional opposition, with a range of instruments, co-optation. They know how to co-opt the leaders. They know how to intimidate them. They know how to send the police to the established organizations, how to send the tax inspectors or arrest the credit cards, like with Navalny, for instance, network more recently. But they know less how to deal with these wildcat grassroots protests with direct actions that are largely leaderless, that are largely unorganized. And I think this is also very much relevant to our talk, whether this kind of mobilization, the wildcat, like we saw in Vladikavkaz recently because of the COVID pandemic, whether they're going to spread throughout the country and whether the regime would be able to counter this kind of contention. So maybe two questions that I would also like to tackle at the end. How large is this grassroots mobilization? And how, compared to other organizers, compared to other streams of contention, how visible is it? We try to, the data is sparse on that issue, and what we've tried to do at the center, which sort of compile the catalog of protest events, and here you can see the data for 2012-2016, and essentially we counted the amount of grassroots mobilization, meaning the protests that were organized by local citizens on the local issues, and surprisingly, the amount of this mobilization is almost constant over time. So it's from 5 to 11%. On average, it's 8% in total. It's far behind the party mobilization, for instance. You can see the second row, the political parties organization of protest events. It's 1/5 of all of the total. And by the way, the trade unions, for instance, account for 15% of the total. Meaning that grassroots are less visible and they're less organized. But for that sake, the political parties, their primary purpose is to stage political rallies and political protests. Meaning that 8% is not a small number. It's quite a constant and visible stream of contention. The other thing is that so we know that there is a lot of this kind of contention going on, grassroots mobilization going on in Russian cities, in field construction, evictions, infrastructural projects, the demolition of green recreational areas. And here is, for instance, the other data that we are now dealing with, the urban conflict episodes, the streams of mobilization. And you can see, for instance, that Novosibirsk is far over the other cities in this regards, even before Anatoly Lokot, the KPRF member, took a mayorship in 2014. So there is a lot of this kind of contention going on in the cities, but how successful is it? So we also try to do that with this data. We try to categorize the episodes of contentions into three large groups. One is whether the projects proposed by the developers or the public authorities were implemented without any changes or with some small concessions, whether they were implemented with large concessions or completely cancelled. So the activists won in this case, or there are also two residual categories of the episodes that were that we were not able to categorize. We were not able to define the outcome, or they were ongoing at the time of the coding. So surprisingly for us, the prior studies show that the rate of success for this kind of grassroots mobilization should be low. But what we see with this data is definitely something more of a balance. So in 30% of the cases of these 124 conflicts that we coded, actually, the governments and the developers stepped back from their initial projects, or they did some big changes in the projects, meaning that they had some large concessions to the mobilized. So there is this kind of quite unusual, surprising rate of success for the grassroots mobilization on the ground. And it reflects the fact that, after all, this mobilization can be considered as a mere sort of blimp or the futile attempt of the citizens to defend their rights. So, and I think, just to wrap it up, more recently we have this turn to the comfortable living environment rhetoric on behalf of the mayor Sobyanin and in many other cities. We see that urban government, urban authorities across the country, they're trying to sort of change the rules of the game about the development business, etc. And definitely they're trying to play this card. They're trying to appease to this middle class who is now more concerned with the quality of urban environment, with the quality of living environment. And I think the potential of this turn, of this departure from the two decades of the power alliance between the developers and the local public authorities is that it can put a wedge in these political machines. It can break these machines. And it can lead to to a certain strain on the public bureaucracy in terms of how to handle these cases, how to prevent these cases, how to prevent this grassroots mobilization. So, in short, in sum, I would say if definitely the grassroots mobilization does not pose a direct threat to Putin's regime. But it does show that there are limits in this state-society contract, and maybe in the meantime, this grassroots mobilization can help turn the society into a more civil one, one that is more prepared to sort of tame the Leviathan, to use the metaphor I put in the policy memo. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrei. Let's now move to our Q&A discussion. Henry, you're welcome to join us back on the video. So I invite everybody to ask questions or comments on the Q&A boxes, and I will be looking at that regularly. We had a first question that I think is a key one about the probability of public protest becoming higher or not, or will it be? Can we be in this kind of Soviet, time where, in fact, everybody feel kind of dissatisfied with the regime, but nobody is ready to go in the street until something happened, like we had the perestroika. So do we need to wait for a kind of specific moment where people will be ready to go in the street in a bigger number, or you think that it will just pile up progressively? Andrei, maybe that's a question for you, but of course, Henry is welcome to add also.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. That's a great question. As I said, my idea is that, of course, the nationwide mobilization in Russia is quite rare. So we know that there were like three maybe major episodes in 2005 against the monetization of benefits in 2000 and 2012 for election movement, and more recently the campaign of Alexei Navalny in 2017-2019. So these kind of large campaigns in Putin's Russia are quite rare. So to paraphrase Henry's book, we would ask ourselves, why not social movements in Russia? And they are pretty rare. But to say that it's impossible to expect under the current condition, I think it's a little bit an overstatement. So there is work going on the ground in terms of gaining this capacity of collective actions, of bridging certain actors and issues across the ideological lines. There are limits. There are really huge limits, both imposed by the regime and inherent to the mobilization itself. Like the grassroots activists, they're usually very suspicious of political parties and especially the opposition. They are hesitant to work with them. They think that the opposition will steal their cause, their issues. But more generally, this is a hard work within the authoritarian regime, and it's going on. And there's something, the links and the necessary capital, the necessary learning process is going on. And also, just maybe one additional small thing. The society also learned how to deal with the regime's coercive apparatus. They developed an infrastructure like the OVD Info and other organizations working with the activists and providing them legal help. I think this is important in terms of how the society now learns how to counter these regimes' offense on that.
Thank you, Andrei. We have also a question for Henry, more about the possible dissensions among elites. Yeah, Henry, do you want to answer also the first question? We can't hear you, Henry. At least I cannot. Yeah, it's coming back. We don't hear you.
Okay, I can take both.
Yes, it's back. Yes,
see if I can move.
Please. It's good now.
Okay. Can you hear me better? Okay,
yes.
All right. I can take both questions if you want to give me the one on elites as well, so maybe they'll fit together.
Yeah, good. So no, the question generally on the possibility of dissensions among the elites who could, as you said, related to the current crisis and the possible emergence of new figure who would be dealing with the crisis. Of course, in the US, everybody would be making the comparison with the New York governor emerging as a kind of unexpected new political figure. Could we see something similar in the Russian case, or just the elites feeling like more insecure?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly wouldn't expect. I would not expect any major rupture. What I would imagine is they're probably more likely to be kind of growing, tensions and kind of internal rivalries, right? Like I wouldn't expect people to kind of break with Putin, but what I would expect is the possibility as dissatisfaction grows in society, if that's what indeed happens with the pandemic, that there'll be more incentives to kind of distance themselves from some of the official positions and try to distinguish themselves from others within the regime that they might consider to be rivals. And so, I think it is possible you could see, people like Sergei Sobyanin, right, mayor of Moscow. He's certainly been subject to a lot of criticism as well. But on the other hand, he's been the one kind of out front taking a strong position, at least as it's kind of seen on the ground by a lot of people, kind of fighting the virus. So, at the same time, he's a very close associate to Putin. So I certainly would not expect him to go into opposition. But, I think the dissension would be kind of competition to position oneself to be the successor. That said, this kind of links up to the other question on protests. I just say very briefly, the kind of in addition to Andrei's excellent kind of analysis of the foundations for protest, right, and the kind of structural conditions there. I think the potential for dissatisfaction in society, there's a significant chance for that to be growing, and you have that potentially combining with focal points which could crystallize protests, both especially if the referendum is the plebiscite is held later rather than sooner. That potentially becomes a flashpoint. Then you have local elections, Duma elections the following year that could kind of help crystallize some of those sentiments. And all that, if those mobilizations are significant and if the public opinion environment appears conducive for opposition, then at a certain point there may be some figures kind of at least flirting with opposition, right? I wouldn't expect any kind of major breaks, but it'll loosen things up and make things kind of challenging for the regime. The last thing I just toss in terms of protest is there's some very interesting survey work that's been led by Olga Onu and the Mobilize project, which does comparative public opinion analysis on and other things on protests across the world. And so, they've recently had some results in that I think they're going to be publishing soon from Argentina and Ukraine, which indicate that despite the virus, people are still willing to go out and protest. Even people that say they fear the virus, they're not willing to kind of give up on their civic rights, even in times of kind of lockdown. So, one implication from that would be that, the era of protest is certainly not dead, and is likely to be, relevant in the years to come.
Thank you so much. We had several questions now that I will try to summarize, asking you both to articulate the link between what is grassroots and what is political opposition, and how can we dissociate them, or how do they overlap in the case of Navalny, for example, and how can we do we see a change in the term of the quality of the protests moving from local grievance to a kind of more political abstract demands? So if you could look at these two elements of the articulation between what is local and what is political, would be good. There were several questions on that.
That sounds like for Andre.
Sure. Yeah, sure, I can take it. I think this is an important question as well, because we tend to think that the protests or the collective actions are sort of in the baskets. There are political protests, or the protests for the civic rights, for political rights, there are economic protests, like launched by, say, trade unions. I think so. These baskets are somehow they are helpful in terms of analytical, work. But sometimes, I mean, in reality, we know that they're sort of blended together. The frames can be more blended that we might expect. And here, I mean, the divide between local and the opposition is quite clear. What we define, for instance, in my project, the local issues. These are the issues that concern the transformation of urban environments, the local urban environment, say infill construction again, or demolition of your local square. They're largely apolitical in the sense that they do not tackle the questions of power, civic rights, but they can evolve into that, and they usually evolve into this direction if the authorities are not very much responsive to the initial cause. And the opposition, on the other hand, we know that the opposition is trying to use this kind of mobilization in multiple ways. For instance, I think one of the points we're trying to make with Jan Dalbaum and Yelena Sirotkina in one of our papers is that his campaign in 2017 was sort of organized around grassroots. So it sort of it harnessed the energy of these grassroots and then put it in this top-down organizational structure and gave the local activists with the more or less national frames and resources and skills necessary to become an opposition. So, in short, I'd say the local protests, the local collective, the grassroots in general, they do not necessarily unfold into the political opposition actions, and usually they do not. Like the frequency is not that high. But again, depending on the context and depending on the situation, they provide crucial resources for the opposition, which is for non-systemic opposition in general, especially given that it's now devoid of any sort of access to the institutional arenas like elections or public offices. So, I mean, there is a sort of divide between these two groups, but sometimes it's not very much clear analytically, and maybe it's not very useful.
Right, thank you. A question now, probably more to Henry, about the possible trajectory of the regime after the pandemic crisis. You mentioned that briefly at the end of your talk, but do you think that depending how the situation is managed, the regime could feel obliged to kind of readjust the way it's building the social contract? There are a lot of discussion about how the healthcare system can deal with the current crisis and how people could see that as an element of delegitimizing the regime, as we see, for example, as we see in Europe globally. So if you could develop on this kind of trajectory of the regime issue.
Yeah, I think a lot is up in the air now, and a lot will hinge on how the authorities here wind up. I say here because I'm in Moscow at the moment. Wind up dealing with the crisis, right? And so if things go pretty well, like it's going to come out, either they'll probably come out not so bad. I still think the underlying economic problems are probably going to eat away at their authority. But I think the kind of situation that would be most potentially the biggest driver of change would be if things get bad, like really, really bad. And I think that one thing about the way the system works is that there's a lot of improvisation, and kind of my take, which I've kind of developed in particular together with Nikolai Petrov and Maria Lippmann, among others, is that the regime is constantly in some form of change as it's reacting, proactively, sometimes reactively in others, to changing environments and different shocks. This is one of the biggest it's faced. But in the past, they've always been pretty good at, finding some way to refresh the regime, even in times of, what would otherwise seem to be really a serious crisis. The financial collapse of 2008-ish, right? It was big, right? Huge drop in growth, but they still rode it out pretty well at the big protest of 2011, 2012, but they found ways of rebounding. So I think kind of concretely what I might expect is, the efforts to find some way to, refresh the regime. And that could be any number of things, it could be, in fact, giving incentive to engineer some kind of succession. I mean, one of the things that, be a risky strategy, but one of the things that I think is sometimes forgotten is that the peak, if you look at the data from Levada Center on, in the balance between people thinking that the country was going in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction, was in the move to the tandem in 2008, even higher a little bit than Crimea. Of course, that quickly went downhill as people got kind of disillusioned with that, but I think what that does show is that, they may move in unexpected directions to try and find things, try to move things out. And it could be, as well, kind of somehow a reopening to the world, right? I mean, again, I think these are kind of long shots. My point in mentioning those is just that I don't think we can rule out like a wide range of possible ways in which they might try to react and create a sense of freshness and newness if they think their power depends on it. Of course, the downside could be that if they try to mobilize some kind of ethnic nationalism or external aggression, kind of trying to do again what was done for Crimea, right? That's the kind of the really dangerous side, which we also can't rule out. But those options also become very difficult in times of economic crisis, especially if people start to feel that, okay, well, why are we going into this adventure, abroad, especially if costs are involved when people at home are suffering, right? So those options also become more and more difficult. So, on one hand, the options are constraining. On the other hand, the regime has been very good at improvising over the years in unexpected ways. So I wouldn't rule out that they'll find a way to pull another rabbit out of the hat.
Good, thank you, Henry. Andre, we had several questions about grassroots mobilization. One about the role of social media. Do we tend to kind of overestimate the role that social media play in mobilizing people? And several questions related to the kind of the regional dimension of social protest. How can we explain that in some region we have a very active kind of grassroots movement, in some other region we don't? Can we say that it's because you have a different kind of grassroots activist, or is that because you have a governor who is managing things differently? How would you characterize this kind of very diverse regional situation in terms of grassroots mobilization?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just one short point on what Henry last said. I think, the regime is pretty much, again, skillful in playing multiple cards and in an unexpected way, and in an unexpected ways. But then it comes to the opposition as well. How is this tango is played? Whether the opposition would be inventive or not. I mean, Navalny steps towards like median voter with his 5 steps program. I think this is one of the pretty much creative thing to try at the moment, and try to outwit the regime, and then see how the regime will react. So I think mostly like this dynamic between the regime and the protests is hinged on this sort of two-way play dance between these two parties, and whether the opposition will be more creative than usual, because the usual response from the opposition that we have to unite, but we can't. Yabloko has its own ideological stance. It doesn't like Navalny. The party doesn't like Navalny. Navalny doesn't like Yabloko, and everyone is sort of in a disarray in this regards. Whether they will be creative in this regards, like creating this nationwide coalition, I think this is the major question for the opposition, and it's perennial again for almost 2 decades, whether they will be able to unite or not. Social media, I'm not an expert on that, definitely, because we don't follow. We know that we do follow in this project on urban conflicts. We do follow the groups that were created in Contacti and on other platforms. Definitely plays a great role in coordinating the efforts of the citizens of the grassroots to melt the frames, to create discussions, etc. But I mean, most of the actions are taking place offline. So again, the protests are offline. The petition making, the court hearings, they're all offline. Well, now maybe more and more online because of the pandemic. But the usual stuff of the mobilization is offline, and social media, they do provide some platforms for coordinating, for exchanging, for discussions, especially again in the restrictions in independent media. But I wouldn't say it plays like a decisive role in mobilization. The citizens are already pre-mobilized before they come to the certain platform and see that there is the group in Contacte, for instance, that unites people against the new infrastructural project of Moscow administration, like the southeastern border. The regional variation, I think it's a very big question. There were several attempts to understand why there is a regional variation in protest activity. I tried it as well. It all comes to the data, to the models, etc. I would say there are certain predictors of the intensity of the mobilization. One is that simply the size of the region. So the larger the population, the more it's concentrated in urban areas, the more it's contentious. Moscow and St. Petersburg and Yekaterinburg, Perm, and Novosibirsk, they're all 1 million plus cities with lots of grievances, with a diverse organizational environments. And it's sort of an important thing as well. But on the other hand, I've also, in my other sort of studies, I've also tried other things to play with. And definitely one of the things is that political openness measured differently. It can be Petrov-Titkov index, it can be electoral strengths of the opposition parties. It has some strengths in explaining the variation, the cross-regional variation in intensity of protests. So there are some structural things, of course, the population size, to a less extent the size of the economy, but also the extent to which the opposition actors and the openness of the regional political system is presented. It also has some at least some role in this process.
Thank you. So we will soon be running out of time. So I would like to ask a last question that, in fact, goes to the two of you, which is that so the Duma adopted the law, which, among many other things, can ease the rule for remote voting, which, of course, open large perspective for possible frauds. And so the question is that how do you think this kind of remote voting can be used by the regime as a kind of new administrative resource to build on or to create legitimacy when the legitimacy is in fact declining, and how that can also be potentially seen as a new reasons for protesters to kind of go in the street against this kind of new usurpation of the public voting. So on this remote voting being both used by the regime and potentially being also an element for the opposition or for the protesters to kind of demonstrate that that's not the way they want things to work. Henry, do you want to begin?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think all these moves like that open up possibilities for abuse. At the same time, I think that the authorities don't have unlimited possibilities of getting away with it, right? If the results are too out of line, the official results are too out of line with what people kind of feel that the obvious, results should be, right? If they're kind of too obviously different, which is what kind of happened in some of the color revolutions, among other things, then, that can become a spark for protests and dissent. And also, there are a lot of people here in Russia that are very good at detecting fraud. There are all kinds of little traces of fraud that can be detected in patterns of results. And if it turns out that one particular type of voting correlates very heavily with, pro-Kremlin results, then, that can also kind of fuel the fire. And, sure, the kind of people perpetrating fraud can try to get ahead of that, right, and try to do it. But then, it's hard to kind of fully cover one's tracks. And so, my guess is that, maybe it may be that moves like this could generate, a little bit more fraud than might otherwise be possible, but probably doesn't make it easier to get rid, to kind of get away with, kind of large scale, just totally stealing an election.
Thank you. Andrei?
Yeah. Maybe there is a slight probability that regime is concerned about public health, and hence it wants to institute this remote voting. And well, I mean, it's indicative how quick we are to take this option from the table and say, well, the regime is definitely not concerned about public health. It's more about manipulation, the orchestration of elections, etc. And I'd say, that's probably the best bet we can have. That the remote voting is designed to take control of the Kremlin for the urgent matters, like again maybe organizing the plebiscite sooner than later, or controlling the regional elections in September, etc. I think when it comes to potential for mobilization around this issue, we know that civic rights and political rights, and especially the voting rights, they matter for a small fraction of Russians. This is an active fraction. It is online. It is educated. It is resourceful. So, as 2011, 2012, and Navalny's campaign in 2017, 2019 showed, it's quite capable. This fraction is quite capable of mobilization. But does it mean that the majority of Russians will mobilize against the remote voting? I wouldn't bet on that. I would say that it's highly improbable.
Great, thank you.
Well, it's already.
Yes, of course, Henry.
I just say, I think that's right. I didn't mean to imply that there's no concern for public health at all. And I think that it puts the regime in a difficult position because, like you saw in the United States and Wisconsin, right? They went ahead with elections and got a lot of blowback for that. So it's kind of like you're darned if you do, you're darned if you don't in this particular case. But I think going ahead like this, right? It might kind of solve one problem, but it does open up the possibility for abuse.
Yeah, great conclusion. Well, wanted to thank you, the two of you, for this great presentation, and Henry for being with us from Moscow. We send you, the two of you, a lot of virtual applause that you cannot hear, but they are there. And I also wanted to thank all our participants. Please look at Andres and Henry's memos on our PONAR's website and stay in tune with the Institute. We will have another seminar on Russia next week, May 21st, where we will be discussing the regional response to COVID-19 crisis. And so once again, looking at this kind of unexpected regionalization or decentralization of the way Russia is responding to the crisis. So once again, Henry and Andre, thank you so much, and be safe, everybody at home, and hope to be in touch very soon. Thank you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, and thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you, bye-bye.